Hey guys, it's History Behind the Warrior, and welcome back to another God of War video. Today, after our in-depth breakdown, I wanted to take things back a little to the lore side of things, honing in on the Twilight end of the gods, Ragnarok. This video will be largely focused on its mythological source material, the gods and beasts that do die during the Battle of Ragnarok. And of course, finally, how could this translate over into the God of War universe? As whilst the game is set in Norse mythology, it is done ever so loosely that there is enough creative freedom that it doesn't exactly line up with every established idea and concept. So there are still twists and turns on established lore and canon, like the Fall of Balder just being an example of one of them. Now, it should pretty much go without saying, but of course, kind of spoilers ahead, as we will be talking about the fate of the gods and what could possibly happen in God of War Ragnarok. So, if you wish to go in completely blind, I do not recommend watching this video. But as always everyone, before we do begin, I would super appreciate it if we could first get this video to about 500 likes. It may seem like a small thing, but it does go a great way, supporting not only this video, but also this channel out as a whole. And with us drawing closer and closer to the release date of Ragnarok, you definitely want to stay up to date with all of the God of War news we do have going on here. But before we do begin, here is a quick message from today's sponsor, Manscaped. This is a sponsor I've been dying to have on the channel because, well, even before this, I've been a fan of their products. For those unfamiliar, Manscaped is a global brand for men's grooming and hygiene, battling the BO of Midgard with tools and liquid formulas for your body, butt, and well, balls. Courtesy of this sponsorship, Manscaped has given me their Performance Package 4.0 set, a beautiful kit with a tool for nearly every situation to keep things tidy in your pants. This includes their new Lawnmower 4.0, a beautiful skin-safe hair trimmer that is so refined that not only is it cordless, but also waterproof with an LED, one that does display its battery life, as it does come with a 90-minute charge. The Lawnmower 4.0 also has a travel lock feature. Along with this, it comes with the Crop Reviver and Preserver, truly a gift from the gods for odor protection. So apply them after a shower to keep everything tidy, fresh, and clean. And finally, we get the Weed Whacker, a skin-safe nose and hair trimmer designed to cut away at those hell barbs in the most sensitive of spots. So, if this has grabbed you by the balls, please go to manscaped.com and use my promo code at the checkout, HBTW20, to get 20% off, plus free international shipping, and 2 free gifts: the Shed Travel Bag and Anti-Chafing Boxer Briefs. This really is a solid deal, so thank you to Manscaped for sponsoring this video. But anyway, back to the video. At the dawn of it all sits the children of Fenrir, Skoll, and Hati, infamously known as the wolves that consume the sun and the moon. The wolf giant's kin play a pivotal role in Ragnarok itself, as their feast upon the sun and moon marks the beginning of the end for the Aesir. Now, the reason I'm actually mentioning this is because in many depictions of Ragnarok, more so that of Germanic tales, the sun and moon are not simply what they seem to be, instead being depicted as physical beings and gods of the sun and moon, with the sun god being known as Sol and the moon being known as Mani. So yes, in some versions of Ragnarok, the death of the physical manifestation of the sun and moon gods is what brings on the end. Now, as for how this translates into the game world is a bit hard to say, as currently we do know that whilst the sons of Fenrir do exist and are present, we do not know about Mani or Sol. Either way, this is still a really fun idea and fact to throw out there, especially when we take into mind how Helios' death worked in the Olympus trilogy of games, marking the end of that sun. onto our next god. We now touch on the Vanir god, Freyr. Yes, Freyr, not Freya. For those still relatively new to Norse mythology, or might not even really know who this is, Freyr is the twin brother of the goddess Freya, but he's most infamously known as the Vanir god that was effectively the catalyst for the infamous Aesir-Vanir War, having failed in his ability to unite the Aesir gods under his banner of peace. So, in short, he is seen as a very important figure in the world of God of War, as it leads to an all-out battle that would only end once Freyr was forced to marry into the Odinson bloodline, bringing an end to the unending blood feud. Following these events, Freyr would actually relocate to the realm of Alfheim, becoming a somewhat ambassador for both the light and the dark elves. By doing so, he was able to invoke a form of peace that was never seen before. However, the god has mysteriously disappeared prior to the events of the 2018 game, and little to no explanation has really explained what has happened to him. So, it raises some questions and suspicions as to what has ultimately become of Freyr, and what does it mean to Ragnarok itself? Well, touching back on the Nordic texts, during the siege of Asgard, following the somewhat death of the sun and moon, Freyr would perish during the fall of Asgard's wall, being crushed by the likes of Surtr as he marches to the heart of Asgard. Now, again, we don't know how much of this really translates into game, as Freyr would be in direct opposition of the Aesir. So his death to Surtr would seem kind of counterintuitive of both of their ultimate goals. But there always is the possibility that he could be part of the fire giant's collateral damage, especially if Surtr is acting as more of an agent of the cycle, opposed to a giant sinister villain of destruction. Currently, we do not know what role Freyr could play in game, but with how much foreshadowing the character has had, as well as the fact I believe he is one of the two Vanir carved statues, it's hard not to feel like there is something planned for the Vanir god. The next two gods we will be touching on is Loki, the god of mischief, and the guardian of the Bifrost, Heimdall. Now, in Norse mythology, these two are fated to fall to each other's blades, both suffering from fatal wounds. But again, how could this work in the God of War universe? Well, it's pretty hard to pin down, as currently, we haven't really had any actual exposure to Heimdall or any information surrounding him. He's been name dropped once, but outside of that, we don't really know what to expect from the god. But considering his role in Ragnarok, and how his Gjallarhorn is the one to alert Asgard of Ragnarok, I could say his inclusion is more or less guaranteed. Now, as for Loki, this is of course where things are completely different, as the Atreus interpretation of Loki is widely different from its source material counterpart. Going back to what I said earlier about the creative freedom that this interpretation of God of War has. In my honest opinion, considering how integral Atreus is to this series of games, I think the likelihood of him dying is slim to none. I'm not going to entirely dismiss it, but I think right now he is far too integral to that of the main narrative to slip through the cracks, especially if they're looking to pass the torch to another character, if Kratos was to somewhat step aside. Now, our next god here is Tyr, the Aesir god of war. Now, Tyr himself is a very important figure in Norse mythology, being a son of Odin and the one responsible for binding Fenrir, at the cost of one of his hands, mind you. He is seen in his Norse texts as a beloved and strong figure amongst the pantheon, but in game, things couldn't be any more different. Branded as a traitor by his own father, Tyr is banished from the Nine Realms and is incarcerated to lands unknown, punishment for having saved the Jotuns of Midgard. He is marked by his brothers and sisters as a symbol of their weakness, and his disappearance is felt throughout the lands, leading to many asking, what happened to Tyr? But again, how does this all tie to his mythological counterpart and could reflect in-game? Well, after the binding of Fenrir fails and the walls of Asgard crumble, it would be stormed by the enemies of Asgard, including a hellhound by the name of Garmr, a pet to the goddess of hell. Now, the depictions of Tyr's death actually does vary on which interpretation you read, because there are many scenarios where he is killed by the hellhound, but in some translations, it is actually Fenrir that vanquishes the god of war. And again, in some iterations, they are considered to be the same being. So yes, it does get a little bit strange and also very confusing. As for how this translates into game, that is very hard to say, as this would softly imply some form of friction or betrayal from Tyr in order for him to line up with his mythological counterpart. And in this universe, Tyr is well framed in a far more positive light, so it's very hard to say just how much of this slips into game. As for Garmr, I do have a strong feeling that we will not be seeing the Hellhound at all, as Fenrir has already been established, and we do know that he resides in the present. Our next death here is of the fire giant Surtr, a being who is destined to plunge his mighty blade into the heart of Asgard, shattering the world tree with the primordial flame, setting it ablaze, and really being the one responsible for having the cycle turn once more. But of course, this is moments before the mighty giant falls to the hand of both Thor and Odin, as it takes their combined might in order to stop the behemoth. Now, in Norse mythology and game, we do know that the cycle does turn, as Ragnarok is endless in Norse mythology, at least in most common depictions. And we do know that in the game world, we do currently exist in Timeline 2, or at least a timeline that takes place after a previous one. So there isn't exactly a secret behind the destined fate of Surtr. The next two we will be touching on is Jormungandr and Thor, probably the most iconic fated duel to take place in a destined tomorrow. The bold Serpent and Thor have a long-running rivalry that quite literally does transcend time. And it's fairly understandable, seeing as the pair are well aware of how their battle is destined to end, with each falling to the other's hand. But how does this come to be? Well, when we take a look at Norse mythology, and we specifically hone in on their battle, we see that Thor is ultimately victorious, having slayed the world serpent with Mjolnir, but it is the poison in his wounds that eventually takes his life, walking 9 steps forward before finally collapsing. So, it marks an end to the Odinson. But how does this translate into game? Well, here are where things get really interesting. With the world serpent being tossed back in time, it really does throw its mythology into a bit of a tailspin, as it deviates quite far away from its source material. So, with that said, it leaves us to come up with a number of different assumptions. One is that the world serpent is in fact immortal, having been continuously cast back through time endlessly since the first cycle. The second, and the most realistic, is that the current Jormungandr must die so Atreus can bring life to another and then send him back in time. So the loop still does continue. I hope that makes sense, because time travel. Our third and somewhat final theory is that it is not the world serpent that is fated to kill Thor, but actually Kratos. It's a very small and minor thing, but in hindsight is actually quite brilliant. During the Spartans' first interaction with Jormungandr, where the axe is swallowed by the giant's beast, once the blade is called back, we see the game display that is ether imbued, For those who don't know, this is actually an ancient form of poison that originates from the very first giant, Ymir, and it's also the poison that is designed to take the life of Thor. So the seeds have been sown for the downfall of the Odinson. It's all just a matter of waiting to see just how this all does unfold, and whether or not the world serpent does survive. Our final duo here is the almighty Allfather Odin and the Eater of Worlds, the Great Wolf Fenrir. The somewhat legendary climax of Ragnarok finishes with the Allfather perishing to the fangs of the Great Wolf Fenrir. After the binding of the wolf fails and Asgard is stormed, the wolf is able to hound the Allfather down. So, it does mark an end for the king and Fenrir himself, because not long after his father's demise, Vidar, the Asgardian god of vengeance, would split the wolf's jaw in half, marking a true and very much so bloody end to that of Ragnarok. But again, how could this work in the God of War universe? And honestly, it's very hard to say, because all three of these characters are yet to make a proper in-game appearance. And in saying that, we've only just had a small glimpse of Fenrir, so there's a lot of questions that does surround this topic, and the answers we do have at hand. As for Odin, it's only logical to believe that he will die by the end of this tale, but by whose hands? That's ultimately left up in the air. Going back to what I said about Jormungandr, we do know that a version of Fenrir does exist in the present. We just don't know if whether or not it is immortal, or if it has to die for the loop to cycle. Along with that, we're bringing in Vidar to the equation, but there's also no evidence right now that this god currently exists in the God of War universe. So sadly, I can't really give us a structured answer, but more ways and options the narrative could unfold. Now, our last and final god here is, well, Kratos. Always got to save the best till last. The Spartan has had a long and heartbreaking journey. From being a servant to Ares, to destroying Olympus, to relocating to Midgard. It should really go without saying, the ghost of Sparta has suffered. But here, in this new and breathing world, his son Atreus is able to ignite a spark of hope in him, one that will carry on into Ragnarok. But the real question is, will that spark continue to linger? Not bound by the laws of Ragnarok or its source material, Kratos' existence in a different pantheon really does throw a spanner in how this narrative can unfold. As really, he's kind of capable of anything here. But with the Jotunheim mural depicting his death, we are left with the question of, will it actually happen? Well, whilst I know this figure has been a large center of many debates, for the sake of discussion and conversation, let's say it is. And how this is possible? Well, in the Norse age, and the introduction of Atreus, it does introduce the idea of passing the torch. And narratively, it's already foreshadowed the idea of Kratos giving his life to protect Atreus. So the idea definitely sits on the table. And even then, it's not really that big of a deal. I know a lot of people lose their minds over the idea of Kratos dying. But truth be told, he's died before, and he's come back every single time. He is simply too angry to die. So let's say he does die. It's not gonna be the end of him. Plus, we are yet to be introduced to the goddess of hell. So, will Kratos die? Probably, but it won't be the be-all and end-all of this character. I do not expect the Spartan to stay down. And like that, this has been it for who will die in Ragnarok. I hope you enjoyed this video and it's given you some insight on what you can possibly expect in the climax of the Norse series of games. Please do remember, so much of this is theoretical at best and thus should be taken as such. So don't expect everything I say here to flourish in game. So think of it as a fun thesis of what we know of Ragnarok mythologically, and what we know of the world established by the God of War universe. But until then, guys, this has been it for me. So as always, stay strong, stay well, and keep on fighting as Ragnarok comes for us all. Take care, everyone. I'll see you soon.